Greetings everyone and welcome into the PCB webinar. My name is Gzim and I am the Portfolio Manager for Security at PCB. Today I will be as an organizer of this webinar and I hope we will have an interactive webinar with all the questions and your comments. This is our last webinar on security portfolio for this round and we will get back in September with the quite common and hot topics. And we want to thank you all for being able to follow us on all of our session. We hope you have gained a considerable knowledge with our highly qualified presenters and their attractive topics. I will also take this opportunity to inform you that we will organize a training event from June 27th to July 1st on Stockholm, Sweden, with the topic Advanced Auditing Techniques. You can find more information on our website or by writing out event 2016 at pcb.com. Okay, let's back to our presentation. As you know, this webinar we will hear about the topic 16 steps in the ISO 27001 implementation. This session will be presented from our partner, Mr. Dejan Košutić. Mr. Košutić is the main ISO 27001 expert in Advisera. He has extensive working experience both as a tutor and a consultant. He is an approved tutor for ISMS lead auditor courses and delivers various ISO 27001 in-person courses throughout Europe as well as online courses via webinars. We hope this webinar will help you understand the implementation process of ISO 27001, and if you have any question you can write them at any time in question box in the right hand control panel, or you can use the option to raise your hand and we will answer to all of them accordingly. Please, Dejan, you may continue.
Thank you, Gzim, and hello everyone again, and thank you for attending this webinar. Basically at this today webinar I'll give you an overview of what you need to do to implement ISO 27001 standard. And I'm not sure if you already read my blog and my articles regarding ISO 27001 standard, but basically what I'm going to present you today is really basically my overview, or let's say my thoughts about how to succeed with this standard. Okay, let me go just for the beginning. You know, very often I see companies enter this ISO 27001 implementation thinking they can do it in, let's say, a month or two. And, you know, and this, let's say, a wrong approach to the implementation only gets them stuck in a project, and ultimately this kind of project not only that lasts much more than these, let's say, a couple of months, but it also costs much more. So what I'll show you in this webinar is what are the mandatory steps in the implementation, and really to get you to know what is the scope of the project so that you have some realistic expectations. So this webinar today is mainly intended for people who are, let's say, beginners in this area, so people that have no experience with ISO 27001 implementation. So what I'll do is really use, let's say, plain language so that you can understand it easily, even though that you're not experienced information security implementer. Okay, now as I mentioned before, one of the crucial things to know is that if you want your project to be successful, you really need to know exactly what's ahead of you. So exactly what are the steps, exactly let's say what is the intention of this project, exactly how you're going to organize the project management and so on. Because without all of these things you'll probably have problems in your project. And this is exactly what I'll show you today. What are the steps and what to be aware of and what to, let's say, take care of before actually starting the project. Okay, now, you know, very often first reaction of most people I talk to when, let's say, speaking the first time about ISO 27001, and they say something like, yeah, I heard about this standard, and, you know, this standard is nothing else but, you know, huge pile of documents. And unfortunately, and there really is this kind of, let's say, perception of ISO 27001, but also other ISO standards like ISO 9001, that it is only about documentation, that it is only about, I don't know, satisfying the certification auditor. It's only about writing some documents, just to take care of the certification and nothing else. And really, this is I would say the way to really do it completely wrong, because the point of all these standards, including ISO 27001, is that this documentation has to be made in such a way that it will help you actually in your day-to-day work. So for instance, if you create, I don't know, a backup policy or a backup procedure, you should really use this backup procedure document in a day-to-day use. I mean, you will have to comply with it in your day-to-day operations, so you should make it in such a way that it really helps you, that it doesn't really create you problems in your operations. So my point is, you shouldn't really view this implementation as a kind of a bureaucratic or compliance job. You should actually implement it in a proper way, so that actually it can really help you with your day-to-day operations, with your day-to-day security tasks. Okay, now just to show you the agenda for today, so I have 3 major topics that I would like to go through today. First one is these 16 steps that you need to take if you want to be compliant fully with the standard. Now you may or may not go for the certification, but nevertheless, if you want to be compliant fully with the standard, still you have to go through all of these 16 steps. The second topic is how to sell this whole idea to your top management, because if you're working as an information security practitioner, you probably know that it's not really easy to get let's say, approval of such a project from the top management, or even if you do get the approval, then they're still not really willing to support you when it comes when you encounter some kind of problems. And the third topic is really what are the strategic options that you can take for the implementation. Basically, there are 3 strategic options, and I will also explain them. Good. Now let's go first through these 16 steps. So basically, the first step is really this management support that I mentioned in the previous slide, and this is really, I mean, the crucial thing, because from my experience working with numerous clients, is that if the top management didn't really provide a real support to, let's say, ISO 27001 implementation, then most of these projects really failed, or if they didn't fail, then they kept on running for, I don't know, years and years before going to a finish. So when I speak about the support, I mean the real support, meaning that they will give you enough money, enough human resources to finish this kind of a project. Okay, this is something that should be normally reflected in your budget, in your human resource plan, and these kind of things. The next step is to really establish project management, because you can't really expect this standard to be implemented, just along the way of some other things. So you can't really give, the task of ISO 27001 implementation to your system administrator and tell him, look, I mean, take some time to do this, alongside of your regular job. It's not going to work. So, I mean, you really have to treat it as a project, meaning you need to have a project manager. If you are, let's say, a larger company, you would also need a project team. You definitely need a project sponsor, meaning someone from the top management. You need to have some clear milestones, some clear outputs or deliverables from this project, and so on. So this is something you have to establish from the very beginning if you want to have a very clear, if you want to have a successful project or successful implementation. Typically, you would write a project plan, although this project plan is really not required by the standard. The next step is to identify the requirements. And basically, this is how we do identify these requirements. First of all, you should list all the interested parties. Now, interested parties are typically, let's say, your clients, because of course they're interested in that you're keeping their information safe. But this could be your partners. This could be, let's say, your suppliers sometimes. This could be government agencies who want you to, let's say, implement certain regulations and so on. So once you have this list of interested parties, then you have to list all of their requirements. And for instance, the clients will have these requirements normally stipulated within your contracts that you've signed with these clients. With your partners also, you will have certain security clauses in your contract, so you have to list these as requirements. You have to list all the laws and regulations as requirements. So basically, you have to list all of these requirements, and then in the next steps, you will, when you start developing your ISMS, meaning your Information Security Management System, you have to make sure that you're compliant with all of these requirements. So you could say that these requirements are somehow one of the main inputs into, so to say, configuring your ISMS. Okay, the next step is to define the scope of the implementation and the, let's say, management intention. So first of all, you have to define the so-called ISMS scope, whether you're going to implement the standard in your whole company, or are you going to implement it only in one part of your company. So for instance, if you're a smaller company like 20 employees in one location, of course the scope of your implementation should be your whole company. But if you're a company of, let's say, 20,000 employees, if you're operating on, I don't know, 10 locations, then it probably makes sense to only start, let's say, with one department or maybe one location or one process, so that the scope is defined as not your whole company but only part of your company, and then afterwards, after you learn how to do it, then you can expand the scope to your whole company. The other thing is that you have to write this policy. In your information security policy, you have to define what is the management intention, meaning what is the what your management wants to do with information security, what does it want to achieve, and also the objectives, which are, let's say, measurable objectives with which you will be able to really measure very precisely if your ISMS has met all the goals, so to say. The next step is the part where you will have to assess the risks. Now, this risk assessment is, let's say, the core idea of ISO 27001. Basically, ISO 27001 tells you the following. You should implement the controls only if there is really a need to implement these controls. Now, one of the needs might be through these requirements that I mentioned earlier, but also the need might be if there is a risk. In other words, if there are no requirements and if there are no risks, then you shouldn't implement particular controls. Okay, so the implementation of controls needs to be dependent directly on the results of listing these requirements and on the risk assessment. So when it comes to risk assessment, you need to define exactly the method or the process how the risks are going to be assessed. And this is what is normally described in risk assessment methodology. This is one of the mandatory documents. So you shouldn't really start your risk assessment before defining the risk assessment methodology. Okay, the next step is the performing the risk assessment and treatment. So basically, during the risk assessment, you find out which risks exist. Okay, so this is let's say a kind of analysis. And then during the risk treatment, you define which controls you will apply or which other treatment options you will apply to control those risks. Okay, and as a output of this process, you will have the risk assessment report. Then the next step is that you should write this document called Statement of Applicability. Now, I know it's kind of, let's say, a strange title for a document, and that this document is not normally used outside, let's say, of ISO 27001, but the point of Statement of Applicability is that you have to list all of the controls from the Annex A. Now, Annex A of ISO 27001 is nothing else but a catalog of 114 controls that the standard suggests that you can use. And then, based on the results of the risk assessment, and also based on the results of this list of requirements, then you should decide which of these controls are applicable and which of these controls are not applicable. And you have to list all of these 114 controls and define which one is applicable and which one is not. The next step is defining the risk treatment plan. Now, this risk treatment plan is, I would say, a logical consequence of statement of applicability, because just to give you an example, let's say that you have written this statement of applicability and you would list all 114 controls, and out of these 114 you would say that you have 105 applicable controls, which means that 9 are not applicable. And let's say that out of these 105 that are applicable, you have already implemented 85 prior to starting the project. Because if you read the standard, if you read these controls, you will realize that most of these controls are, I would say, common sense, and it's in most cases you will implement these controls, like, I don't know, backup or antivirus. So it's you know, it's highly likely that you already have those. So the point is, let's say that you have implemented 85 and that you need to implement extra 20 controls so that you will be fully compliant with your statement of applicability. Now, these 20 controls that are not yet implemented, this is something that is that needs to be specified in risk treatment plan. So you would have to define for each of these 20 who is going to implement them, in which time frame. In other words, what are the deadlines? What is the budget? What other resources are needed, and so on. So you could also call this risk treatment plan as a kind of implementation plan. This would be, let's say, more appropriate name for it. Okay, let me just go through a couple of questions that I received in the meantime. So Fernando is asking, is it true that the certification should be asked by the business? I'm not sure what you mean here, but definitely the top management of your company should be the one to initiate the certification. So I would say this is the business decision whether you need to go for the certification or not. John is asking, risk treatment plan is part of the project. Yes, you could include risk treatment plan in your project plan, but I would actually advise you not to do it, because risk treatment plan is a document that will be, let's say, so to call, alive even after your project is finished. So after you initially implement the standard, you will still have some controls that need to be implemented. So basically you will close your project plan, but your risk treatment plan will still need to be operational. So I would advise you to have it as a two separate documents. Okay, John is asking, is this a sub-product? I'm not sure if I understand your question, so if you could repeat it. Okay, John is also asking, ISO 27001 could be by law. Well, there are some regulations in some of the countries that are requiring you to implement this standard, but I would say this is still rather rare. But I'll come to this a little bit later when I speak about the benefits of the implementation. Good. Now let's move on to the next step in the steps in the certification. The next step is really to define. You should define how to measure the effectiveness of your controls or of your whole system. So basically, you can, develop some kind of a methodology for measurement, but it doesn't really have to be anything so, I would say, so dramatically complicated. Basically, you should only define, which method you will use for following or let's say measuring all the objectives that you have set, and then you will basically have to report them to your top management. The next step is to implement, of course, all the controls or safeguards and all the support procedures, and of course this will create a certain number of policies and procedures and plans and so on. This is typically the step that takes most of the time and most of the money during your implementation, so you should, I would say, do it very carefully, and you shouldn't really get too ambitious, I would say. So if you're a smaller company, again, if you're, let's say, 20 employees, it doesn't make sense to write 50 documents. It really makes no sense. So basically you should try to, for smaller companies, you should try to remain only on the mandatory documents, which are something like a dozen, and you shouldn't really write any extra documents for a smaller company. Now, of course, if you're a large company of 20,000 employees, then if you write, I don't know, 100 documents, this is still something that could be, let's say, acceptable for such a larger company. I just send you a link so that you can see the list of mandatory documents. Just give me a second, please. Okay, so here is the link. I'll send you through the chat. This link. This is an article which speaks about all the mandatory documentation required by ISO 27001. Okay, now the next step is to implement training and awareness programs. So this is something that needs to be done in parallel actually to implementing the controls. Because first of all, you cannot expect employees to, let's say, run some new technology or to perform some new processes if they don't know how to do it. So you have to train them to be able to do this. And second thing, even more important probably, is to make them aware of why this is necessary. Because, I mean, let's face it, it's no one really likes to, I don't know, change the password every 3 months. So you have to explain why is this necessary for the company, why is this necessary for everyone that is employed in this company. So these training and awareness programs are really crucial, and they have to be done in parallel to the whole implementation. The next step is to operate the ISMS. Now, this operation of the ISMS is nothing else, you know, using all these documentation, all these rules in a day-to-day basis. So again, using this example of, I don't know, backup procedure, if you define that you will do the backup, I don't know, every 6 hours, then you have to do it every 6 hours. Now, what does this mean? This means that you shouldn't write rules which are not really applicable to you. If there are no risks, and if there are no requirements which would require you to perform the backup every 6 hours, then why would you do it? No, you shouldn't write the policies or procedures which make no sense for your company. You really have to think it out before starting to write the documents. Okay, the next step is really to monitor the ISMS, meaning you have to monitor how the things are performing. So, for instance, you will monitor, I don't know, you can monitor the fault logs for your servers, but you can also monitor how many incidents you have. You can monitor some, let's say, non-technical things about, I don't know, the level of knowledge of your employees, and so on and so on. All these things need to be monitored because you want to be aware of how successful your information security management system is. Also, one of the mandatory steps is to perform internal audit. Internal audit is, let's say, an audit which should be performed at least once a year, and it can be performed by one of your employees. And the thing is, this is something that the purpose of internal audit is to show you an objective picture of how really compliant you are with the standard and with the documentation. So basically, this is something that should be your main input for doing the improvements in your ISMS. Because you may have some, let's say, idealistic picture of how your ISMS is doing, but in reality, people may not really comply with everything that you have said in the documentation. So the purpose of the internal audit is really to find it out, and then you can take some corrective actions. And by the way, we have this online courses for internal auditor that we do also together with the PCB. And these online courses are actually free, but you can also go for the PCB certification for this internal audit course, and I'll give you now the link, so just give me a second. Okay. So just give me a second, and here it is. Good. Here you'll see this internal auditor course. So as I mentioned, this course is free. This is an online course. But if you want to, you can go for the PCB certification, and for this you would have to pay a fee, but you would get also the certificate if you pass the exam. Okay, the next step is to go for for you to perform the management review. Management review is nothing else but let's say a point in time where your top management needs to make some crucial decisions regarding your ISMS. So this could mean, let's say, reviewing if the objectives have been achieved, adding some new budget to your information security, setting some new objectives, introducing some new policies or procedures, etc., etc. So this is really where actually the standard requires your top management to be involved, because otherwise actually the information security management system wouldn't make sense if your top management wouldn't be informed and involved regarding this. Okay, now you would also need to do improvements. So based on your, let's say, internal audit findings, based on your management review conclusions, you always have to make some improvements, and these are normally made in terms of corrective actions. This is also a mandatory part of ISO 27001 implementation. Okay, basically these are these 16 steps that are necessary for the implementation, and once you complete these 16 steps, then you're actually ready to go for the certification if this is something that that you would find beneficial for your company. Okay, yeah, just to mention actually that actually in 2 days' time, so on Friday, I will be launching a new book. This is my new book on ISO 27001. So you can actually read about all these steps in this new book that you will be able to get in a couple of days only. So I'll send you now the link, and if you want to, you can actually register for this new book so that we will notify you once it is published. Anyway, the point is that all these things that I mentioned are explained into much more detail in this book. Okay, let me go now on to the next slide, and this is about how to sell this whole idea of ISO 27001 to your management. And what you have to really take care about is that you don't speak in technical terms when presenting the let's say case for ISO 27001 implementation to your top management. You shouldn't be speaking in terms of firewalls or antiviruses or servers or anything like this, because basically they're not interested in something like this. You should be speaking in terms of benefits, in terms of business benefits, okay, because they can understand this kind of a language. And from my, let's say, point of view, there are 4 main business benefits that you can present them. The first one is compliance. So if you have someone of you have mentioned that there are some actually laws that you require to implement ISO 27001. So if there is a law which requires you to implement ISO 27001, then you have an easy job, because this is required by the law, and then you have to do it. But also you could have situations where there are laws which are, I would say, similar to ISO 27001, and this is much more common. For instance, these privacy laws, or let's say laws which require the handling of confidential information, they're all more or less based on ISO 27001. So you can actually present to your top management that if you implement the standard, then you can you will have a framework to comply with all of these laws and regulations, which is, I would say, a very powerful thing to say to your top management. Then the next thing is really marketing edge. I mean, if you have the certificate as a company, the chances are that you will have some certain advantage over your competitors in the market. Because if you have clients who are really sensitive on keeping their information safe, and you say, look, I have this certificate which proves that we will keep your information safe, then you have higher chances of getting new clients and new revenues. And this is something definitely that will ring the bell, let's say, to your top management, because they always like to hear, words like new customers and higher market share or new revenues. Also lowering the expenses. Now, the whole idea of ISO 27001 is to prevent incidents from happening. So if you basically invest a certain amount of money into the implementation of ISO 27001, most likely you will prevent some incidents from happening, and the cost of these incidents are probably going to be like 10 times bigger. So you're investing now to save money later, which means, yes, you will be able to lower the expenses in maybe not short term, but let's say in the next 2 or 3 years. And then the last one is, the last benefit is really to optimize business processes, because the standard requires you to define exactly who is responsible for what and who has to do what and when, which is quite useful if you don't have those kind of procedures in a company. So this is something that you should also do. So my point is, I'm not saying that all of these 4 benefits are applicable to your company, but chances are that at least 2 or 3 are applicable. So you should really consider and think well which of these are applicable to you, and then present or let's say think about how to present this whole case to your top management. Okay, now let's move on to this last slide about strategic options. So when starting to implement the standard, basically you have 3 options between which you have to decide on. The first one is to implement the standard using your employees only and without any external help. And this approach does make sense when you have something very confidential within your company and you don't want anyone from the outside to see this. This also makes sense if you have, let's say, lots of time to implement the standard and if your budget is extremely low. So basically you're using existing resources and you're not paying anything extra. Now the second, I would say also rather traditional way to implement the standard is to hire a consultant. So basically a consultant is a person who will do all the, who will come to your company, perform the work on site, who will perform, let's say, all the analysis that are necessary, who will write all the documentation, who will train your people, and so on and so on. And this approach makes sense if you're really in a hurry, because this approach is, let's say, the quickest way to implement the standard, but on the other hand, it's also the most expensive one, because good consultants cost money. Bad consultants cost even more, unfortunately. And also the downside of this approach is that you will have to open, let's say, your company to someone from the outside, and if you have something confidential, this could be a problem. Now the third option is something that is, let's say, becoming more popular lately, and this is something that we at 27001 Academy are let's say, focusing on, and this is the combination actually of the first 2 approaches. So basically what this third approach is all about is that your employees are implementing the standard, but that you get all the know-how and that you get all the knowledge and support from someone from the outside. So as I said, this is something that we specialize in, and I'm not saying that this third approach is the best, that it works the best for each company. I'm just saying that you should really think about, well, in which situation are you currently, and then decide, if you're really in a hurry, you should hire a consultant. If you have really extremely low budget, then you should implement it completely on your own. So basically, it's really depending on the situation, you should choose an appropriate option for your company. Okay, now let me move on to some of the conclusions. And then we'll go through the rest of the questions. So I would say that if you set up the implementation properly, then you can actually resolve many more issues in your company than you initially expected. So it's especially about this, let's say, getting new clients and getting more revenues, or organizing your company in a better way. This is probably not something that you would expect initially from the implementation. But if you do it in a proper way, these are exactly the benefits that you will get. So you have to be aware of this. And of course, discuss with your colleagues which benefits you can achieve, and then this is something that you can use as let's say that you can use to present to your top management. Okay, now let me go back now just to the questions. Because there are many questions that are coming in the meantime, so let me go through this. Just give me a second. Okay, John is asking, do we get a copy of the presentation? I think that the organizers, the PCB will provide you with the presentation. I'm not sure, but Gazim will definitely address this later on. Okay, Tony is asking, is it a must to be trained or oriented about ISO 27002 before the 27001 implementation? The answer is no. 27002 standard is only about, this is actually a guideline that helps you with the implementation of controls. So basically you don't need to be trained on this, especially if you have, I don't know, a consultant or some other help which will, help you with the implementation of the controls. Of course, it's very good to be trained on ISO 27001. This is definitely a good training to go for. Panagiotis is asking, will you publish this presentation? Oh, okay, this is something that I already answered. Good. Leoma is asking, now that we have implemented ISO 27001 in my company, what next? How do I keep the staff interested and motivated to make ISMS as a culture? Okay. Well, I would say there are a couple of methods to do this. First of all, and I think the most important thing of all is really that your documentation that you have written makes sense. Because if you have written some nonsense in your documentation, then no amount of training or awareness sessions will make it correct. So first of all, you have to make sure that you write only the documents you need and that they are written in such a way that they really apply to your company. So this is first thing. Second thing, of course, is that the person who is in charge of information security, so this could be like Chief Information Security Officer, has to work continuously on educating people around him. And this could be done through, let's say, formal training or awareness sessions, but it also has to be done in various informal, let's say, occasions where the CISO should really present some cases of why this is good and present some good examples, some bad examples, and so on and so on. So I would say this is a continuous struggle. And you could take a parallel example of, I don't know, managing quality in a company. Because, if you don't manage quality in your company on a continuous basis, ultimately your products will be obsolete or they will be with a lower quality. So, it's basically this would bring your company into bankruptcy. And this is similar here. You always have to work on your security because this is a never-ending process. Okay. Panagiotis is asking, are you aware of any specific European laws or directives that favor ISO 27001? This depends really on country to country. For instance, in my country, in Croatia, there is one law that requires, sorry, not law, but regulation that is related to telecom companies, which requires telecom companies to implement ISO 27001. But this is rather an exception than a rule, and really I don't know actually the examples from other EU countries. Weil is asking, does management review necessary to be a meeting or can it be conducted in other ways? It can be conducted in other ways. It could be a meeting, let's say, which is done through online means, so you don't have to physically meet. But also you can perform the management review without meeting your colleagues. You can simply, members of the top management can receive the reports, let's say, through some electronic means and then make certain decisions without actually meeting the other colleagues from top management. Okay, John is asking, step 3 is the best sharing knowledge, embedding way of working in the governance structure. Well, yes, if you're referring to the third option of strategic option of implementing the standard, of course I agree with you because this is how we make our living, but yes, I cannot really be too objective in regards to this. Okay, John is also saying by consultants you lose knowledge. Yes, this could be a problem with the consultants is that when they leave, if they don't transfer all the knowledge to your employees, this could be a problem. But if you hire a consultant, you should really hire someone who will make sure that all the knowledge is really transferred to the employees. You should really choose someone who is good in this. Okay, Olga is asking, do you have any examples of controls mentioned by you earlier during the presentations? Well, the best really would be to take the standard and read the controls. I will give you actually a link to an article which describes these controls in general terms. So just give me a second. Okay. Okay, here comes the link, and here you will see this overview of this Annex A. So I mean, these controls can go from technical, like backup or I don't know, antivirus. These controls can be in terms of human resources. So let's say that you verify the background of some, let's say, candidate that wants to work in your company. It can be in terms of, I don't know, organizational things like defining who is responsible for what, and so on and so on. So there are many controls, but less than 50% of these controls are related to IT, and something like more than a half are related to physical security, organizational security, human resources security, legal stuff, and so on. Okay, let me go further. Henry is asking, will I be right to say that all the certification processes have the same implementation framework? I'm not sure if I understand your question, but the certification doesn't really depend on the implementation. So the certification process has, let's say, a logic on its own, and no matter how you implement the standard, the certification will be done in a certain way. So, I mean, there are many, I would say, ways to implement the standard, but no matter how you implement the standard, the certification process will have its own, let's say, process in a way and the criteria to do this. Okay. John is saying the biggest risk is governance, PDCA cycle, and business continuous and business hygiene. Okay. Olga, okay, fine. So I think that's more or less we have gone through all of the questions, so I'm sorry to go really so quickly through them, but I want really to finish up in time. So basically I think this is it. Gizim, can you please take over?
Yes, Dan, thank you for sharing this highly informative presentation, and we believe the attendees had the chance to learn many new things today. And I suggest you to follow us on our website and social networks during this season to see for our recent outcomes, and we will get back again on September with a new webinar topics. Thank you once again, and look forward to meet you on our next round.